Fala pessoal, estamos aqui, Pode estar podcast, em parceria com o CREA Mútua e com o FEA, direto da COP30, uma edição especial. Estamos aqui com um professor especialista em energia, gás e cozinha. Ele vem da Universidade de Loughborough, no UK, e a nossa entrevista vai ser em inglês, ok? Então, aprecie nossa entrevista, curta, siga, compartilhe, mande joinha, coração, nós adoramos. So, Professor, thank you very much for being here with us. It's a pleasure to receive you. We are looking forward to have a great debate. All right. So, Miss Professor Ed Brown, he's from Loughborough University in the UK, and he's here to talk to us about his initiative about cooking, energy, and climate justice. So, can you please introduce your project for us?
Certainly. I lead a UK aid funded program. It's called Modern Energy Cooking Services. And we've been working for the last 8 years or so. And we basically are around providing clean, affordable solutions for cooking, largely in countries in Africa and Southern Asia.
Excellent. So, Mr. Professor, looking to climate justice, cooking, the utilization of gas, we had a previous debate here that was very rich. I appreciate your insights. And when it comes to your initiative, what results can you share with us, and what are the perspectives for the future?
I think the first place to start is to explain why it's such a major issue. I remember we were talking about this earlier. I think you were a little bit shocked by this, but that something like 2.1 billion of the world's population have absolutely no access to any clean cooking fuels. What I mean by that is that they are cooking with wood or charcoal or coal or dung, or even, as we explained, plastic. Um, Another maybe a billion on top of that only have partial access to those clean cooking fuels. And it's one of the SDGs, under SDG 7. One of the targets is to bring modern cooking fuels to everybody globally by 2030. There's no way we're going to get there. We are beginning to show progress to a certain degree. What we've focused on is those solutions that are going to be long-term sustainable. So that means we've worked on LPG, we've worked on biogas, we've worked on ethanol, but the area that we think is the most scalable and is the most sustainable in the long term is electric cooking. And by that, we mean cooking with a whole range of different types of appliances, ranging from kettles to induction stoves to pressure cookers to Instapots to rice cookers, all of those different types of appliances on grid, as an increasing part of the world's population are now connected to electricity, or in those areas where they're not connected to the grid, either through mini grids or through standalone solar systems.
Excellent. Because I understand that each country has a different energetic reality. So perhaps ethanol or even other solutions are not that you can apply to Nigeria cannot be applied to Myanmar, for example. That's a very different reality. When it comes to funding, because the reality is that we were talking about for nations to transition and for people to transition, especially people who are already in poverty, because they are the main recipients of those programs. They need funding to do that, but not only funding, they also need information because you can fund, but if you do not give them information, they will never know how to use those solutions. So when it comes to funding, what is the reality of your program? Which countries are financing this initiative? And where do you think we can look forward for more financing?
That's a really good question. I think so. First things first is that you will only find funding for these kinds of initiatives where it's made a political priority. And I think one thing I have seen, which encourages me over the course of the last few years, is governments which have the largest deficits in clean cooking are really starting to promote clean cooking as one of their major priorities. So before this COP, a lot of the African presidents came together under the leadership of the Tanzanian government, and one of their top priorities for negotiations at COP was to bring in resources to support clean cooking initiatives. Interestingly, your own government's action agenda for this COP also put clean cooking as one of the most important global challenges. So in that sense, I think the political will, both from the governments of the countries with the deficits and from the governments that are putting most money into the multilateral agencies or through donors and so on, I think we begin to see that there is recognition of the seriousness of the issue and the beginnings of at least announcements of resourcing. There is I could talk at length for this, as you probably can tell, but I think for me, the most important opportunity that there is in Africa, for example, as one of the as the place where the majority of people without access are located, is the amount of money needed is enormous. And it means that one of the most important challenges is how do we draw in resources that are already destined for the region and then utilize those resources to make sure that clean cooking is incorporated into the policies that are being developed. I'll give you an example of that. You may have heard of perhaps the biggest initiative by the World Bank and the African Development Bank at the moment is something called Mission 300. So Mission 300 is a commitment by those organizations and the IFC to bring electricity to 300 million of the 600 million that currently lack access by 2030. So with the amount of resources that are being dedicated to that task, our argument is that this is a fantastic opportunity to provide a little further resourcing that provides electric cooking appliances to those people that are being newly connected to the grid at a subsidized cost. Because we found that actually in the majority of cases, it's actually cheaper to use electricity than a lot of alternatives, including charcoal. The main impediment to people being able to do that is firstly that their electricity connections are not strong enough to enable wiring and so on to enable them to do that, and secondly that the cost of the appliances for them to buy them up front is too much for most people because they don't have the financial resources to do that. So if you ensure that the new connections are made in such a way that e-cooking, electric cooking is possible, and at the same time provide mechanisms whereby you can spread the cost of the appliance, for example, through your electricity bills or something of that nature over like 2 or 3 years, then it becomes much easier for people to afford to take on board that as a potential solution.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. So, I understand that the reality of a country like Ethiopia is very different from Brazil here in Latin America, though we may have a similar population. Here in Brazil, we have a program from the federal government that in Portuguese is called Luz para Todos, in English, Light for Everyone. So we have many isolated communities here in Brazil, and I was wondering whether how can we bring to here a solution or initiatives like yours, because we understand that we also have great need. I just mentioned to you that in my own city, we have isolated indigenous communities that need stable electricity. And when we look to the future, a country like Brazil that already has a very clean energy system grid, for example, how we can, even if we don't manage to have funding for a program like yours in here, how we can strengthen a partnership that we can kind of do a copy and paste of your solution in here. Because not only families, but we can also work on communities because we have communities that work and cook together, especially in most remote areas.
I think that's I think there's all sorts of opportunities for cross-global learning and collaboration. So I think I agree that there are some of the types of initiatives we've been funding would certainly have real possibilities here. I think the biggest challenge you have is that those communities that don't have access to clean cooking in Brazil now are the poorest communities,
Yes.
which obviously then means you have an issue with if you just provide the appliances and so on, they won't have the ability to pay for them unless there is some initiative along the lines that I'm suggesting, which then means you obviously need some form of subsidization for that kind of initiative. Maybe that's easier when you're dealing with a relatively small subset of your population, so it becomes part of social policy in that sense. However, I think the other interesting thing for Brazil and for other countries in Latin America is not just those communities that have no access now, but also thinking through longer term, what is the access to cooking fuels? I think we talked earlier on, and that I was always struck by the fact that most people here in Brazil use LPG for cooking, and yet you have this massive industry on ethanol. So I'm quite interested as to why ethanol is not utilized here. And then also I'm imagining that for Brazil, at least one of the motivations is that you produce your own LPG, right?
Yes, but it goes beyond that. To better answer your question, I think I also need to give you a reference. I was talking to an Italian businessman here in Rome, and he asked me, Juan, why does in Brazil you have a car that can run with ethanol, gasoline, and electricity, while in Italy we can only choose? Because here, basically all cars we have, they are hybrids, or they at least accept two different substances. And I just answer him, well, but I assume that every car can accept at least two or three solutions because that is the reality of Brazil. And when it comes to cooking specifically, as much as we are referencing ethanol, even compared to America that use corn and we use sugarcane for the production, reality is that we culturally don't use ethanol as a solution for cooking because it was not conceived for that. It is an option as a source of energy, but we understand there are dangers in terms of safety. So when it comes to the gas in itself, we can sell that in a recipient that is safer. So we think about safety because here you don't use gas through a cane, for example.
You know, that's really interesting because one of the things we've found across Africa is that there are some countries that have had really cheap electricity for many decades, and actually the spread of cooking with electricity in those countries is more widespread and also more accepted. Whereas in other countries, it's been LPG that has been begun to be introduced in urban areas in those countries which have begun that transition. And it's interesting, in those countries where LPG is, when we've tried to introduce electricity, there's a concern about safety. And so as you introduce electricity, when you introduce gas, there's a concern about safety. So actually, in those senses, there's as much a social dimension to these issues, cultural, social, all of those kinds of dimensions. The other thing I wanted to say, though, is the other big question that all of this generates is what is the long-term cost of the subsidization of these different fuels? So, for example, the spread of LPG in Brazil and in many other Latin American countries has come through long-term processes of subsidization. And we all know that one of the big debates globally is the phasing out of fossil fuel subsidization. And we know that, for example, Ecuador tried to do a major shift from subsidizing LPG to subsidizing electricity, and they found it immensely challenging. And there were many kind of political manifestations and even riots against the proposed changes. So it's not only a socio-cultural issue; it's also a political issue in terms of the way in which subsidies become embedded. So one of the issues that we're currently looking at globally is the different models of subsidization, how sustainable they are long term. For countries, for example, that have your own sources of LPG, it's much easier to sustain more widespread subsidization models than it is for countries that are having to import gas and then subsidize it. So, for example, we've been working with the government of India a lot recently, who have had perhaps what's presented as the most successful promotional campaign for LPG, but are now facing massive problems in terms of the annual cost of the subsidization of that process. And even even with that subsidization, large portions of the population are actually not buying refills because they don't have the money to actually be able to do that. So it's inherently complex. Obviously the desire, I think, across the board is to introduce long-term, sustainable, economically, culturally, and environmentally policies, and yet we still seem to be a long way from that actually taking root. So one of the things we did last year was we produced a report for the African Union, which was looking at how all of these different factors intertwine together and how you can produce effective, nationally targeted multi-fuel strategies for embedding clean cooking in a long-term sustainable pathway.
Excellent, Professor. We 5 minutes, right? So, you mentioned the case of India. India is a country that imports basically, especially from Russia, and there are some sanctions, a lot of political stuff embedded in that. So the cost of financing gas, LGPD for a population of over 1 billion is massive. It's massive, I'm sure, absolutely. Here in Brazil, we've been having access to cheap electricity for a while. And when we look to diversification, for example, there are many areas where people are having access to electric stoves or stoves that use induction, for example, because it is getting more accessible, not specifically the electricity in itself, but also the material, the stove in itself, because some 15, 20 years ago, people not used to have microwaves, for example, because it was too expensive. So when it comes to different solutions, you mentioned the case of cost because maybe for a family to pay up front, that would be super expensive. But for example, as a reference, how much it would cost to implement your solution for a family of five or six is a reference for us to understand how it would cost and how it would work for the family to pay, or would be your initiative that would pay. Let's say you just come up with a family for your project, how it would work out, the payment, and who pays for that.
I think that's a fantastic question, and it obviously depends on the country, and it depends on the state of the supply chain, and it depends on the types of initiatives that have been introduced. But just to take example of Kenya, where we've been working now for about 6 or 7 years, and there's a good supply chain there. Um, for say a family in a relatively poor urban district, you might find that initially if they want to cook with electricity, they might buy one appliance, yeah. So, and that appliance might be an electric pressure cooker because it's the one that is the cheapest to utilize. So there are two factors at play here. Number one is the cost of the fuel, so the electricity that you would use in terms of utilizing that appliance, and the other is the cost of the appliance itself. In this case, the appliance in the Kenyan market is probably around $60 to $70, which is out of the reach of the majority of poor urban or indeed rural people. So that means that if they can't save up and buy upfront themselves, then it may be that we've worked with a company that is able to provide some form of a credit. So what we might do there is support an intermediary organization to provide the credit to the family pay a deposit and then pay that off over time. Another thing we're doing is working with utilities so that when a customer comes to the utility, they're able to put the cost of an appliance that they buy through the utility onto their electricity bill and then spread that over the length of time. Yeah. Other things we're looking at is, for example, in Uganda, the government has initiated an electric cooking tariff in an attempt to convince people to use electricity for cooking more. And that's been quite successful in encouraging the uptake of electric cooking. I think, interestingly, in those countries in Africa where there has been considerable success in expanding the overall electricity generation and indeed the reach of the network, then one of the things we've been able to argue quite effectively is that actually there's a real win-win at play here. So obviously we need to find solutions to encourage people to move off polluting fuels for their own benefit and for the benefit of the country, for example, to stop deforestation. Um, at the same time, as the utilities and the generation companies and so on are taking out loans from the World Bank or from the African Development Bank, then ultimately those loans have to be paid off. And the problem is that, for example, Kenya over the last 10 years has had massive success in expanding its grid and in bringing new generation capacity online. However, so for example, 10 years ago, only 25% of people were connected to the grid in Kenya. It's now somewhere between 75 and 80%. So that's a massive improvement in just 10 years. However, the majority of those consumers are consuming really small amounts of electricity, which means the utility is not receiving enough money back from its customer base to be in a position to pay off those loans that it took out because it's not generating surplus.
Because they are individuals, not companies.
Exactly. So what we've been trying to do is to make sure that in these electrification initiatives, these last mile electrification programs and so on, that as much attention is put to supporting demand as it is to enhancing supply. Because without mechanisms to support people in buying equipment that they can use to develop new businesses, or so it could be, for example, developing a small restaurant business and using the electricity to run that business.
We need people to use it more.
Precisely. So I'm aware I'm talking a lot, but the other one final thing is at this COP, just when was it? On Saturday, together with a range of other organizations, we launched a new platform for institutional cooking. And one of the main motivations for that is, if you can think, what do we mean by institutional cooking? Cooking in schools, cooking in hospitals, cooking in prisons, those kinds of institutions. Because across Africa, these are really large consumers of wood. 98% of all Kenyan schools, when we did some analysis recently, were currently using wood to cook on, and were paying for that wood. So one of the mechanisms that we're trying to introduce is the transition of schools to electricity, which is fantastic for the utility because it increases the levels of consumption. We found that in the majority of cases, it's significantly reducing fuel bills. So if you can bring in resources to pay for the transition of the schools, long term, it will pay for itself. So that's a really interesting and in a way easier to manage transition than the household level.
Excellent. So, Professor, I have a final question. Mr. Professor, um, when it comes to electricity and electrification and the expansion of the electric grid, is there any experience that we can take from China? Because we know that they have managed to lift over 800 million people out of poverty, and I'm sure that also includes access to food and energy in itself. Is there any experience, any project that you think that you are aware of that you think could be a reference for us? Because the Chinese have managed to implement solutions in large scale, and that is a reality that has imposed itself on us economically. Do you think China can also be a part of the solution for the future?
I absolutely do. It's something that we've not done a great deal of yet. We've actually spent a lot more time learning from India and also from Latin America, actually, interestingly, from the subsidization experiences that we were talking about. But China is massively important, and it is certainly in my mind as one of the next things that we should be doing is actually looking at the relationship with China effectively. Interestingly, where we have had engagement with China is obviously China is the place where the majority of these appliances are manufactured. So in terms of developing supply chains, in terms of bulk purchasing of appliances from China, all of those factors are things that we're looking at. But in terms of Chinese experiences themselves, the one experience I am aware of is the large scale biogas programs that they've developed. And I think even in China, and forgive me if I've got this wrong because I haven't looked at it in a lot of detail, but my understanding is there's a recognition there are only certain types of communities where there is a strong livestock presence within the economic model. Those are the areas where it's easy to embed biogas, and biogas is an important part of the stack of clean cooking kind of opportunities. So I think the lesson we have learned from there is that as well as there being different fuel mixes for whole countries, I think one of the lessons from China is that there are different solutions in different parts of individual countries, dependent on the nature of the economy, the nature of the society. And I think one other factor is that it also shows that there are different cultures of cooking, which actually take different forms of use of cooking fuels. So, for example, Kenya is a culture that has a lot of use of beans and pulses. And so pulses take a long time to cook. And so therefore, actually, in some ways, it's been easier for us to market electric pressure cookers in Kenya because of this long cook component. Because the longer you cook something for, the more the price advantage of something like an electric pressure cooker is, because it's so efficient, because it's insulated.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much. I appreciate. It has been very enriching for me and for our audience. Mr. Professor, is there any final message you'd like to leave to us from this COP, from your attendance here? So, if you have a final message for us, we appreciate.
I think I wanted to say thank you to the people of Belém. I've been to, I think this is my fourth COP, and I really and today, I particularly enjoyed today because coming into the green zone, I've been kind of in the blue zone an awful lot of the time in these big meetings and so on. But I have just found everyone so welcoming and so eager to share the lessons of their lives. So I think, yeah, that would be the main message is that I have felt incredibly welcomed by the people of Belém. I can see you're very proud of hosting COP.
Absolutely.
And yeah, it's been a fantastic experience.
I appreciate. Thank you very much. Siga o Podsa Engenharia, aprecie nossos vídeos, nossas entrevistas em português e inglês. Curta, mande coração, um abraço e ficamos aqui da COP30 junto com o CREA, CREA Pará, Mútua e Confé. Muito obrigado.